Hello there, I'm Alex Wojka, the 14th Lord of Babraham Manor, and today I want to share some of the history behind this manor. In this video, we're going to cover the Babraham Institute, the modern Babraham Hall, and the Hall of the 16th century, how the Norman and Saxon invasions shaped the manor, and even what life was like during the Roman Empire. Even though the Babraham estate has seen many different owners and constructions, there is something familiar about the river and the green hills throughout time. Life began in the area now encompassed by the Babraham site in the Middle Stone Age period. Geographically, it is a prime place for habitation. It has always been close to a water source. It was situated close to the prehistoric trade route, the Icknield Way, and it is overlooked by the Gog-Magog Hills, which provided an obvious fortification. However, the site does not appear to have been permanently populated, but was just used for its flint or for seasonal hunting. Later in the Bronze Age, the area is believed to have been populated. The Gog-Magog Hills were fortified, and there is evidence of a great Bronze Age conflict. However, it is uncertain whether habitation spread down to the Babraham area. The occupation by the Romans lasted from the late Iron Age right through the 2nd and 3rd centuries and well into the 4th century before the site was abandoned. The Romans left most of the archaeology that has been recovered so far, although we still do not know entirely the settlement's purpose, other than it was a small Roman settlement in a rural area. A great deal of metalwork and coinage has been recovered. The proximity to both the Icknield Way and the Via Divana suggests that there was significant passing traffic, such as the legions passing from Colchester to Godmanchester. Occupation of the site probably exploited the ford and the existing Celtic trade routes between the Iceni and Norfolk and the people of the Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire area. There were also the emerging Roman markets in the 1st century that may have used the area as a gateway to the northern territories. After the Romans left Babraham, the area was probably abandoned for a while. There was a Badburg, the equivalent to the name Barbara today, who lived here in the early Saxon period and gave the place its name. Babraham roughly translates to home of Barbara. She was probably the daughter of a chief, and her tribe was most likely wiped out by the Viking invasion. The Domesday Book tells us that the majority of the land was owned by Editha the Fair, wife of King Edward the Confessor and sister to Harold II. She owned 2 of the 5 manors spoken of, one of which was held by Alric the priest. The 3rd manor was owned by Algar, Earl of Mercia, and held by Lady Godiva. Yes, that Lady Godiva made famous by the myth of Coventry. The last 2 manors were owned by Ulwin and Godric respectively. The village was populated by 38 tenants and had 205 sheep, as well as a watermill. Domesday also records that the land of Babraham was sized at 7 hides. 1 hide was equivalent to approximately 120 acres. Babraham was not abandoned after the Norman conquest, though while the land changed hands, the Saxon village remained. If we judge it by tax collection, the village was wealthy for the area. In 1250, the village paid more tax than any other village in the Chilford Hundred, and in 1327 was second only to Linton. Tax also tells us about the population. The village reached a high point in the mid-14th century when 121 people were taxed. The lands of Editha the Fair were given to Count Alan the Red of Brittany. However, Alan went on to become the Earl of Richmond, and although the land passed to other owners, it was said until the 15th century that the land was being held of the honor of Richmond. Count Alan's tenant was Brian de Scalaires, and his descendants lived on the land for nearly 200 years. A Geoffrey de Scalaires gave Babraham Church to Waltham Abbey in the 1180s, and the last de Scalaires on the land was John de Scalaires, who is said to have gone on crusade around 1271. The lands of the 5 manors passed through a series of different hands, but, as with many medieval manors in less crucial locations, large parts of it were given to the church in return for pardons or land elsewhere. The last of Alan the Red's lands in the larger manor, once lived in by the de Scalaires, was given to Brusyard Abbey in 1390 by Roger Ferreur in exchange for lands in Norfolk. At the beginning of the 16th century, most of the land was owned by the church. However, after Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church, he began seizing their lands all over the country, and in 1539 the lands of Babraham were surrendered to the crown. The land passed through several owners in a short space of time until in 1576, when Robert Taylor, a teller of the Exchequer, purchased the estate and proceeded to buy out all other owners in the area. In 1576, Taylor built the first of 3 Babraham halls. You can see the outlining of its gardens in this picture. In the process of building the hall, Taylor demolished the village of Babraham, which had begun in Saxon times, and moved it to its present location. Taylor had barely time to live at Babraham before he lost his fortune when repaying the £7,500 one of his servants had embezzled. Taylor mortgaged his house to Horatio Pallavicini, and in 1589 was forced to sell his home to Pallavicini. Pallavicini was Genoese and came from a powerful Italian noble family. He had come to England at the time of Queen Mary and served as a papal tax collector, being most capable in the collection of the taxes but less successful in sending those taxes on to the Pope. When Mary died, he kept the taxes for himself and loaned some of his new fortune to Mary's sister Queen Elizabeth. In 1587 he was knighted. He also commanded a ship in the battle against the Spanish Armada as a civilian volunteer captain. However, in latter years he fell out of favor with Elizabeth and retired from court to his Babraham estates. While Sir Horatio was said to be a miser, his heir Sir Toby was less careful with money and soon lost the family fortune. He had to sell Babraham to the Bennet family in 1632. Thomas Bennet had his land confiscated in 1651 by the Cromwell government because of his support of Charles I, but had his lands returned and was made a baronet in 1660 when the monarchy was reinstated. Sir Thomas was succeeded by his son Sir Levinus Bennet, who was MP for Cambridgeshire from 1679 to 1693, and the second baronet of Babraham. When Sir Richard Bennet died in 1701, his heir was his only daughter Judith, who died a minor in 1713. As a result, the land passed into the hands of Sir Richard's 5 sisters. Most of the land ultimately passed to Bennet Alexander and the rest to William Mitchell. In 1765, Mitchell owned almost all the land, and in 1770, Babraham was sold to East India Company director Robert Jones. The first house was pulled down in 1768 and piece by piece was sold off. Jones built a square brick house that the Adianas would later regard as small. It was a country house, not the grand hall of Taylor and Pallavicini. Robert Jones's only child, Anne, married Colonel James Warwood Adine, who was also MP for Cambridgeshire from 1780 to 1784. General Adine died in 1802, leaving his 38-year-old son Robert Jones Adine as owner of Babraham. Robert died in 1823, leaving his son Henry John Adine as owner of Babraham. He did not like the house of Robert Jones, and between 1832 and 1837, the house was pulled down and the present Grand Hall was built, although most of the outbuildings to the hall have since been destroyed. The hall was designed by Philip Hardwick, an eminent Victorian English architect who is most famous for the now demolished Euston Arch in London. The Adianas owned the land, and for the first time we are able to hear information on the lives of villagers at Babraham, with whom the Adianas appear to have lived amicably for a predominant period. However, it wasn't all tranquility. For example, in 1820, William Wisby, a shepherd who worked for the Adianas, was murdered by a poacher called William Bonnet, who was never caught. Also, there was the night in August 1826 when 33 sheep were struck by lightning. The Cadogans lived at Babraham from 1875 to 1889, leasing it from the Adianis. During the Second World War, it is said that the house and grounds were used by the Canadian Air Force and also that a Spitfire crashed in the grounds on its return trip to Duxford Air Base. After the Second World War, the Adianas no longer remained in Babraham. They sought a buyer and found one in the Agricultural Research Council, who bought the estate in 1948. By the early 1950s, the first of the large animals were introduced, and the building of the first laboratories had begun. The Second World War awoke the UK to its dependence on trading partners, and the government decided that future means of food production must be secured, with an emphasis on fundamental research on the physiology of farm animals. Ivan de Berg-Daly was appointed to establish a new National Institute for Animal Physiology. He threw himself into this task with enormous enthusiasm, a characteristic much needed during the first formative years. Daly's first steps were to turn the breakfast room of the hall into a laboratory and operating theater, the drawing room into laboratory stores and offices, and the basement into workshops and dark rooms. He held to the principle of trying to find first-class people and largely letting them direct their own research. To help attract staff, he built the close to provide housing on site. In 1993, the institute was renamed the Babraham Institute, and over the next 5 years, the agricultural research was phased out. Today, the institute undertakes innovative research to understand the biological events that underlie the normal function of cells and the implication of failure of abnormalities in these processes. When I moved to the United Kingdom in 2010, I lived in Fulbourn, a village separated by Babraham by the ancient Wool Street. In 2025, I became the 14th Lord of Babraham by ownership of the lawful rights to the lordship. These rights are enshrined in the laws of England as incorporeal hereditaments and have been re-established through due legal process in compliance with the Honours Act of 1925. Here are some notable lords and ladies of Babraham Manor. Leofric, Earl of Mercia, and Lady Godiva in the 11th century. Robert Faffiton at the time of the Domesday Book. Roger Mortimer of Wigmore in the 13th century. And Alexandru Cosmin Voica and Christina Emily Voica since 2025. This has been a history of the Babraham Hall and estate, narrated by my AI clone based on the documents freely made available by the Babraham Institute. Thank you for watching.